Hello, and welcome to Booked Solid, New Canaan Library's podcast for adventurous readers across all genres. I'm your host, Kathleen, a collections librarian.
I'm your host, James, an adult services librarian.
And I'm your host, Kat, a children's librarian.
And today we are talking about Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann.
All right, let me just give you a little introduction to the book in case you haven't read it yourself. In Killers of the Flower Moon, author David Grann documents the Reign of Terror, a series of murders that plagued the Osage Nation in the early 1920s. At the time, the Osage were fabulously wealthy due to oil reserves under their reservation, which led to the Osage becoming the target of a conspiracy to steal these rights from them by murderous means. The book covers the conspiracy from multiple angles, starting with the family of an Osage woman named Molly Burkhart, whose family was being targeted by the murderers, and then it shifts focus to the efforts of the early FBI who were called on to solve the case once early investigations failed or were abandoned. Finally, Grann revisits the case himself and notes what the FBI missed after they declared the case was solved.
As always on Booked Solid, we will be spoiling the entire book. The book is based on a real historical event, so you could read all about it on Wikipedia. However, if you're reading along with us, it hides who the perpetrators are as sort of a spoiler within the book itself.
So what did we think about this book? Did we like it? Kathleen, what did you think?
Yeah, I thought it was great. I mean, it's definitely a heavy read. David Grann writes so beautifully. It's that kind of nonfiction that reads like fiction. It really was fascinating. So even though it was really dark and really talked about some horrible things, it was incredibly readable and engaging, and I definitely couldn't put it down.
Yeah, this was my second time reading this book. I read it shortly after it came out, and I definitely feel like I appreciated it more this time. When I first read it, I was a newer reader to nonfiction, and now I read a lot of nonfiction. And I was really taken aback this time by David Grann's thoughtfulness in his use of direct quotations, the intensity of the research that he did,
yes,
and the very smart sort of structuring overall of the book. It is the kind of book that will make you so angry, you kind of have to put the book down for a few minutes and sort of process what you're reading.
I'm definitely going to second that. I think that the prevailing emotion that I felt while reading this book was anger. Just, the kind of helpless anger because of the events they're in the past. You can't do anything to change them. Just that kind of anger about these kinds of horrors. I did love it. I don't actually read much nonfiction, so I really wasn't sure what I was going to get going into this, but I came away from it very surprised, pleasantly so. David Grann does tell this story remarkably well, with a lot of respect for the subjects of his piece, as well as the people and their descendants. A remarkably well-told story. Actually, that does kind of bring me to, I think, our first point, which is we definitely do have a different levels of reading nonfiction, I think. I don't think Kathleen and I read as much nonfiction as you do, Kat.
Yeah, I think probably half of the books I've read this year, which is 50 books out of the 100 or so I've read, have been nonfiction. And this was one of my gateway into nonfiction books. I'm really passionate about nonfiction because I think it's easier for us to consider novelists or poets artists, but the work that a nonfiction writer does can be just as artistically meaningful and take just as much skill. And David Grann really has proven his merit as a nonfiction writer.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't read as much nonfiction, so for me, the way he portrays it, it was really a gateway for me into nonfiction. I also liked just seeing David Grann's craft within it. I really like the structure of the three sections of the story, and at the end we do see Grann and kind of how he synthesized this story. And so I think it's important because he's both giving credit to all of the people that he interviewed. He's giving credit to the Osage. He's not saying that he discovered this story or that this is something that is purely his reporting. I think he's very humble about it, which is great, but it also shows just that effort of how he is putting the story together, the larger themes and what he's thinking about. And I just thought it was really wonderfully presented.
Yeah, I rarely read nonfiction, if ever. It's very rare that I actually choose to read a nonfiction book. I'm mostly a fiction kind of guy. But picking this up and giving it my first read through, I was very much blown away by how readable it was, and again, struck by the level of craft that David Grann has put towards this book. It's a kind of nonfiction book where he's making an argument. And the argument is based on the facts that he has discovered, the people he's interviewed. It's coming from his research. It's not just him saying, I want you to feel this way. He's saying, here's the events, how they happened, here is the evidence for them, and then by presenting it in a way that is so readable and just so compelling, you cannot help but understand the argument he's making in this book, which is about injustice and resilience. There's a lot of things he's covering here that you might not otherwise see in other types of like true crime media like this.
Yes, I was going to bring that up next, which is that I am not a true crime fan. I understand where a lot of the fascination with crime comes from, sort of understanding the human condition in a lot of cases. But what I appreciated about this book is the ways in which it centers the descendants of victims and survivors in this case, the way that it avoids sort of sensationalizing and gratuitous detail. And I think the best sort of works about crime highlight broader systemic problems, which Killers of the Flower Moon does very eloquently.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is a definite highlighting of the systemic issues that were facing the Osage people and indeed many of the indigenous people in the United States at that time in general. The kind of removal and settler aggression and that kind of stuff going on. Broader context is given to you in this book, but this is a book also that does focus on the Osage people and their unique lived experience in this horrible time period.
It was really interesting. When I was reviewing my notes, a couple things stood out to me. One is that Grann continually highlights how members of the Osage Nations are the only reason any of the murders were ever solved, and they always were aware of the slim chances of them getting justice within the American justice system. And many of them later on, who were not members of the Burkhart family whose murders were investigated thoroughly by the early FBI, but just who had family members die in general, often had like notes that they'd kept in the family for decades waiting for someone to come and investigate it. And Grann is really pointing to the failures of policing in a way that I think true crime can often idealize policing. Another thing is that in the time period of the book, the press is like sensationalizing to the maximum degree, right? They're always describing the crime as like too impossible to believe in the headlines when the trials were going on.
Oh yes, definitely.
I think as well with that portrayal of the press in the time period, Grann is pointing to how it was very easy for like readers of these newspapers to imagine that there were a few conspirators that were capable of this evil, especially William Hale, right? This one devil there, right? Not to say that he wasn't a horrible person, because he was uniquely horrible, but also it's easier to point at one person and say he's the problem than to imagine a broader complicity, which was the actual truth of what was happening at the time period. So before we talk about the specific events in question, James, do you want to summarize the events of the case?
Sure. So, broad picture here. The Osage people were removed from their ancestral lands multiple times over the course of their history by the United States and settlers. In their final relocation, they purchased a reservation land in the northeast of Oklahoma. When doing so, they shrewdly negotiated the permanent ownership of any mineral and oil rights if there was anything discovered in that land. Long story short, a ton of oil was discovered in that land, and because of the way that they had worked out those mineral rights, everybody who was a member of the Osage Nation basically got proceeds whenever those were sold, and that was known as a head right, and you couldn't buy those off people, you had to inherit them. So this conspiracy came about because people were marrying into Osage families, and then Osage people were dying and their head rights were kind of going other places. In this specific instance, the book focuses on the specific scheme and conspiracy that was headed by William Hale, who was a person who organized a bunch of murders and tried to obtain as much of these head rights as possible and kind of defraud and cheat and steal from the Osage in many other different ways as well. But eventually, the FBI is called in and they solve this element of the conspiracy. They finger Hale as the perpetrator and they get someone to turn on him. He goes to prison for a while, so do some of his co-conspirators. At the end of the book, David Grann kind of goes back, looks into this with some of the Osage people and says, this actually is a much broader problem that was happening. Hale wasn't responsible for every murder. There were other murders that weren't sensationalized by the press or talked about as much. It was kind of a systemic thing based on the policies of the United States government and how this head right was established and how the law worked around it.
Yeah, the book really, when you hear it summed up, there's so much in there.
Yes, I've skimmed over So much detail.
So many details. One of the things that struck me rereading the beginning of the book was how neatly and deftly Grann summarizes the series of federal government policies towards indigenous nations. Removal, forced assimilation, allotment, and the boarding school era are all very briefly summarized, I think in like the opening 2-3 chapters, to give readers unfamiliar with that history a gateway into the world of the Osage Nation in the 1920s, which is just points back to the craft of the book, really.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that I was struck by, not being familiar with the particulars of the Reign of Terror, he inserts all of these details that prove to be very important later on, but they just feel like they're kind of describing the world at first and giving context. I think he's such a master of context because there are just so many things that he's pulling and showing you, like, these are the kinds of things that are going on and the ways that the Osage are being victimized, being exploited, but you don't really get a sense that all of that is going to go into the conspiracy. All of that is really making the conspiracy possible. So, I mean, when he talks about head rapes, when he talks about these things, I'm not, I had no understanding, no expectation that this is all going to be really the basis of this horrible conspiracy. I mean, it just seems like a terrible thing that's happening that doesn't feel right. And I don't know if we really talked about also the role of guardians. So
yes.
we actually, so they actually appointed guardians to the Osage, and was clearly a racist policy based on how much Osage blood you had. So it could be your spouse, it could be someone else in your community, and these were basically...
They controlled your pocketbook. You weren't allowed to spend the money you were getting because the government said you were incompetent. So they hired some white guy to take care of your finances.
Pretty much. Thank you for...
I'm sorry, it's beyond belief.
That's the moment when you had to close the book.
Yes, I took a walk when I read that.
It's terrible. And yeah, so the idea that you could need medical treatment, you could need something, and you could be denied anything that you had the money for, that you, by all means, should be able to procure for yourself, and then you could be denied for any reason. And this is kind of later in the book, but Grann discovers just the number of guardians who would have Osage under their guardianship who died mysteriously.
There was one guy who had like 9 Osage that he was guardian of, and all of them were dead. All the systems feed into each other, right? So that everyone in town would upcharge Osage Nation people like tremendous amounts, like 10 times what they would sell something to a white person, they would sell an Osage person. And also we know that 2 of the most prominent doctors in town were a part of the conspiracy and would assist people in murdering Osage people for their head rights. So everyone in town, it seems like, most people were complicit within the system.
Yeah. If they weren't active parts of the murderous elements of the conspiracy, they were just kind of getting in on the grift fest. Here are some people who we can just upcharge them, 10, 100% more than, like 1,000% more than whatever they're worth. So yeah, and it's not just like everyone was involved in this murderous element of the conspiracy. There are people who, these white settlers are in town and they're just upcharging the Osage people. They're doing things like charging like $60,000 for a funeral, like a special rate for the Osage, whereas they would never charge that much for a white settler. And they did refer to themselves as like white settlers. The newspaper would refer to themselves as white versus Osage all the time. So the paper is also getting in on this. I remember in the book, Grant has a detail saying that one of the papers says that the Osage are making so much money and they're making so much money that something will have to be done about it.
Yeah, there's this quote in the book spoken by an Osage person who basically says, if Hale, meaning one of the conspirators, had told what he knew, a high percentage of the county's leading citizens would have been in prison. So if Hale had been honest with the FBI agents, it's not like he would have been the only conspirator to go to jail. And there's a reason they wanted so desperately to get him a light sentence so that he wouldn't then turn around and tell, probably.
Yeah.
It's also worth noting in terms of broader historical commentary that this book touches on, I think, what most people may have heard of the Osage Nation from, which is the Little House on the Prairie books by Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Yes.
Which does not depict them, which depicts them in a stereotypical light, I would say.
Yes.
And I appreciate Grann bringing that sort of at the front of the book as a way almost of seeing what the reader's expectations are, meeting them there, and then guiding them past it.
So yeah, in Little House on the Prairie, when the Wilders are, they're in their home, but they're actually squatting on Osage land.
Mm-hmm.
They're not supposed to be there, but they've built their home here with the expectation that eventually the government's going to come in and say, man, there sure are a lot of white people here. I guess it's time for you Osage people to get out of here. And it doesn't happen in the book.
No.
In the book, the government actually comes in and says, actually, you need to leave this time. So they didn't get what they wanted. But it's interesting that is kind of like a point of view that most people would have is like, oh, the Osage are the people that, I guess, kick these guys out of their home.
Out of their home, yeah.
So to go back to the beginning, though, the story starts, the first section is basically focused on Molly Burkhart and the tragedy befalling her family in particular, as we are first introduced to the death of her sister Anna, which is under mysterious circumstances. And Molly is kind of the voice there saying that this needs to be investigated, that there's something suspicious going on there. And then it kind of traces the series of murders within her family. So then her other sister and her sister's husband, their house is blown up. Her mother...
Yeah.
I know, it sounds so insane.
And, I mean, Anna gets shot in the back of the head in a ditch.
Yeah.
And then, her other sister gets blown up in her home.
Her mother dies as well. Her mother, Lizzie, dies. There was a sister who died earlier. So basically, Molly is this person who no one really expected to live very long because she had diabetes. She was the frail one of the family. And so she's just buried everyone else in her family, and she's basically the only one left at this point. She lives with her husband, Ernest, and her children. And at first, I think there's this feeling that there's a happy marriage, a stable marriage. But then we discover the depths of Ernest's betrayal to her.
His uncle is William Hale. And under his uncle's guidance, he begins to help move forward these plots against her other family members.
So Ernest has basically married into Molly's family. He's married Molly because they can consolidate head rights this way. And he's the villain in her life, along with Hale. It's right in her home.
Yeah. It's a really unbelievable cruelty to marry into a family, have kids, and then be part of a plot against your spouse's family to murder them and steal their property for money. It's not even for like, oh man, I hate this family. It's, I just want your money.
I think so much of it has to do with the ways in which white settlers did not view Osage Nation people as people. One of them points out when the jury was deliberating, it is a question in my mind whether this jury is considering a murder case or not. The question for them to decide is whether a white man killing an Osage is murder or merely cruelty to animals.
Yes, because I believe that there was in that section talking about the court case, they said that the actual punishment for the crime is on the books was like hanging.
Yeah.
He should have been hung, and instead he got life in prison, where Hale went to prison for like 20 years or something, and then got out.
So the book starts with this personal family story, which I think you get very invested in. I definitely got very invested in Molly as a person and what she was going through, and just trying to figure out, I mean, all these horrible things are happening to the point that it seems incomprehensible, the level of the tragedy. And then you get into the second section of the novel, and that's with the FBI coming in.
I love it when the FBI comes in, because the reason they come in is because whatever existed of the legal system in that time period, which the book also covers, which is just a kind of a side note saying that America as a whole didn't like police. The idea of police were kind of iffy, and it was too much like tyranny or something. And so they really didn't have those kinds of police forces, so it was all just like personal arrangements and private eyes and all sorts of weird extrajudicial, judicial stuff going on. That system entirely failed them. It wasn't even basically getting off the ground until Hale himself was basically hiring people to pursue the leads for the investigation, and then when those failed, eventually they pushed for help for the FBI. Or rather, no. Eventually they tried to push for more federal help, and the person they sent to the government to go ask for that help was murdered on the way there. At which point, J. Edgar Hoover was looking at this kind of case and said, oh, if we solve whatever's happening out here, it's going to look really good for us, and then maybe the nation will forget about some previous misdeeds that we got involved in.
It was a self-serving reason to get involved.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think Grann is too forgiving to Hoover. I think he's very aware of the motivations there and very clear-eyed about what was happening. But I think it is interesting then to see what this case was able to do for the FBI and how they were able to spin it.
Yeah, it's one of the founding mythologies of the FBI. It's the unsolvable case, the vast conspiracy. There's an evil person out there doing horrible crimes, and nobody could fix it. And then the FBI came in, and we solved the case.
Which then makes the third section really kind of an interesting coda to that, because it shows, one, not only did the FBI not solve the case or not fully solve the case, not see the depths of the conspiracy, but also I think it really brings the focus back to the Osage and how none of this was mysterious to them. Perhaps some of the particulars were unknown, but certainly what was going on, that people were being murdered, that it was related to head rights, all of these things were known to the Osage and were a story that they were part of a story that persisted to this day, even when it had basically faded in public memory before Grann wrote this book.
I will say, to me, more incredible than the murders was Tom White, the early FBI agent. He is portrayed as very heroic, which I believe, Grann fully believes. That was the part I approached with, I would say, the most skepticism of any part of the book. Given he was a member of the Texas Rangers, that to me was more incredible than a vast conspiracy.
Yes, Grann is a very critical researcher, I feel like, and the subjects. He doesn't shy away from the dirt and the reality of the facts of, like, why is the FBI getting involved in this case? And it's kind of like they want to smooth over their image. They want to get in good with everyone. But Tom White does come across, he's kind of the lead investigator on this case. He does come across as a person who genuinely believes in what, like, the law should stand for, about justice and mercy. He was big on mercy. He didn't like killing in that sense. He becomes a prison warden after the end of this book. At one point he gets, like, kidnapped by prisoners and beaten up, and he doesn't let any retribution happen to them when they get recaught. Like, so he's a really interesting character in this, and is a fascinating perspective to bring into this as a reason why the FBI was successful in this effort. It's because basically he took the lead and he trusted the people that he was actually interacting with. He didn't think the Osage were lying to him, like, right off the bat, like some of the other investigators seemed to, based on White's readings of their notes and reports. So the Osage were not like passive participants in this investigation. They were trying to help, protect themselves from this vast conspiracy that they were unsure where it was coming from.
It was kind of a relief as a reader, I think, getting to someone who actually listened to them.
Yes.
Was trying his best and didn't get immediately murdered by hail.
Yes.
Unlike other people who tried to go to the federal government for help and were murdered on the way, etc. I think that brings us really neatly into discussing Osage resilience in the face of the hardship of this book. One of the strong sort of themes sort of undercutting this book is, the Osage Nation is still here. And the last section of the book, when Grann interviews descendants and interviews Catherine Redcorn, who is the director of the Osage Nation Museum, you really see the resilience of them as a people and the way they've kept this story alive even before David Grann came along and the rest of the world was, I guess, willing to hear it.
Yeah, it's definitely probably one of the reasons why I like this book so much is that, again, it doesn't focus on the lurid details of these murders. It does let you see the kind of grisly reality of the murders, but it also documents the acts of resilience, the way that the Osage were even in these positions that they found themselves in based on, what the government was doing, what the murderers were doing towards their community. They would do things like the lawyer who negotiated for their head rights in the first place. That is an act of resistance. It is looking forward to their own self-interest and putting things in place to pursue it. There's other documented pieces of historical resistance in here as well that really helps the reader get through just how dark this story is, by saying that these are not people who are taking this lying down. They're doing things like they're putting lights out on their doors to try and protect themselves. It's not just sitting and waiting to die. It's not that kind of story.
I'd even say, Molly, who was forced to residential boarding school, keeps Osage culture in her heart. She continues with cultural traditions that would have been, at least from my knowledge, the vast majority of residential schools would not have been allowed to be practiced. And it's worth noting that on osageculture.com, which is a off website from the Osage Nation website, there's a big note that says, in regards to Killers of the Flower Moon, with the movie having just released, trauma is not the end of our story. And I really want to forefront that being a message that the Osage Nation is sending right now.
Yes.
I think for all of the darkness of the book, and I think one thing that we've really talked about is I think it's very responsible in not leaning into any kind of lurid details. But I do think that even though it doesn't necessarily end on a happy or upbeat note, I do think that the book, it really brings it all together. It's really showing the descendants who are still here, who are still doing things. I mean, just the idea that I think he's going into like the library in town and finding these stories that families have written, these self-published kind of accounts of what's been going on. It's very clear that telling these stories within the families that were affected is still going on, and meeting the people, Molly and Ernest's descendants, her granddaughter Margie, who Grann becomes close to through the course of researching this. She obviously has a very complicated history and talks about the pain that Ernest caused the family, and particularly to her father growing up, who's the son of Ernest and Molly. But just the idea that they're still here, they're still thriving. One of the things that I learned about the movie, which I thought was great, is that they have language consultants on that, and it's another way to bring this language back. It's something that they're making a concerted effort to do in Osage Nation, and bringing back all of these traditions so that they are not lost.
I feel like we all really learned a lot from this book. Even though this was a reread, the book moved me very deeply reading it this time, and I'm really glad to have read it for the podcast.
I'm also very happy to have read this one for the podcast. This is an excellent book. I highly recommend that if you haven't read this one, that you go out and read it.
I thought it was excellent. Not only bringing this story to our awareness, but the way that I was able to see it in a historical context, and to understand, the elements of what happened, of how Grann researched it, and how the Osage Nation has survived. All of these things, I think, really made it a very rewarding read.
And let's actually look at some other reads that people might like to take a look at if they enjoyed this one. Let's move on to our read-alikes. Kat, you have a read-alike for us?
I have two nonfiction read-alikes. The first is American Midnight, The Great War of Violent Peace and Democracy's Forgotten Crisis by Adam Hochschild. This covers America from 1917 to 1921, which are the years sort of leading up to Killers of the Flower Moon. I think if you liked Grann and you're not much of a nonfiction reader, Hochschild is another great historical nonfiction writer. And these books side by side really uncover a lot about America in this time period, specifically with regards to racist violence and the press at the time. I also would really recommend Seven Fallen Feathers, Racism, Death, and Hard Truths in a Northern City by Tanya Talaga. Talaga is an Anishinaabe Nation investigative journalist, and she discusses the death of 7 Indigenous students in Thunder Bay, Ontario, from the same school from between 2000 and 2011. It's true crime as well, but it's also very much about the aftermath of the residential school era in Canada.
So for people like James and me who are not big nonfiction readers necessarily, I wanted to pick a fiction book that I thought also touched upon some of the similar themes. It's called Murder on the Red River by Marcy R. Rendon, and this is actually the first book in a series. So this book is set in the 1970s along the Red River Valley. It's a murder mystery featuring a 19-year-old Native American woman named Cash Blackbear, who is like an amateur detective character who also has visions that lead her to details of the case. One of the things I really liked about this book actually was not even the mystery part so much as just the details of Cash's life. She grows up in foster care, and there's a lot of talk about that trauma of Native Americans being separated from families either through boarding schools or foster care, things like that. So she grows up with foster families and has a really tough childhood. But then as she teams up with her one friend, Sheriff Wheaton, she's able to look into this murder, which is of another a Native American man from across the river, and try to find justice that way. So it deals with all of these things: racism, genocide, oppression. It's really all the heavy things about Killers of the Flower Moon, but it is also a compelling fiction story in this case.
And just in case people were really enjoying the way that David Grann wrote this book, you are in luck. David Grann has written other books as well, one of which is The Wager, which is his most recent book, which covers the events of the Wager Mutiny, during which a British warship's crew mutinied after they were shipwrecked on an island off the coast of Chile. And this is a very well told story about sailors and how they tried to survive and what happened in that situation. It is a very good read. All right, so up next we will be reading The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, which is a fantasy novel. I'm sorry, Kathleen. This is a book about a world that is about to end again. This world has ended several times. It takes place on a continent known as the Stillness, and it's about a woman who comes home to find that her husband has murdered her son, taken their daughter, and fled. She swears vengeance on him and begins to pursue him. Also, the empire that rules this world collapses. So that's also happening. Mm-hmm. And a huge rift in the earth opens up and starts spewing forth ash that is going to blot out the sun and blanket the land in apocalyptic darkness. It's a book about the end of the world, exploitation, and the people that society relies on to perpetuate itself and all the injustices within that.
This will be my third time reading this book, and I am so excited.
This will be my first time, and I have to say I did not see the spewing ash coming.
Well, that's it for us here at Book Solid. Thank you all for listening.
We'll see you next time.